Bible reading is Psalm 96. Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord all the earth. Sing to the Lord, praise his name, proclaim his salvation day after day. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvellous deeds among all peoples. For great is the Lord, and most worthy of praise. He is to be feared above all gods. For all the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Splendour and majesty are before him, strength and glory are in his sanctuary. Ascribe to the Lord, all you families of nations. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due to his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. Worship the Lord in the splendour of his holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. The world is firmly established. It cannot be moved. He will judge the peoples with equity. Let the heavens rejoice. Let the earth be glad. Let the sea resound and all that is in it. Let the fields be jubilant and everything in them. Let all the trees of the forest sing for joy. Let all creation rejoice before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in his faithfulness. We're spending the next few weeks looking at the Psalms, so it could be helpful to understand a few things about their purpose first. Psalms are described as the liturgical poetry of ancient Israel. Luther described the book as a little Bible. He went on and said, "In it is comprehended most beautifully and briefly everything that is in the entire Bible." It's a book of many parts. It's a book of poetry with 150 chapters. The Hebrew title literally means songs of praise. And although David is credited with writing 73 of them, there are other contributors including Moses, Solomon, Asaph, and the sons of Korah. That's a great name for a band, and actually there is one whose entire output is contemporary re-renderings of the Psalms. They're on YouTube. The entire collection is thought to have been compiled over a period of about 1,000 years. And the Psalms are traditionally divided into 5 books, possibly to reflect the 5 books of the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Here's a quick summary of one way that you could look at the book of Psalms. There is a shaping of the book of Psalms that traces the wanderings and the story of the children of Israel. This is slightly different. Book 1, which covers Psalms 1 to 41, emphasize how God is beside us. Perhaps the most famous Psalm of all helps us. In the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters." God who is beside us. And David goes on to say, of course, because of that, there's no reason to fear any evil, because God is always with us. Book 2 takes us from Psalms 42 to 72. And here attention is given to how God goes before us. Psalm 51, David confesses his sin and pleads with God to wash away his transgressions, to create in him a clean heart. So God goes before us to create the situation where we can come and confess. The third book, Psalms 73 to 89, reminds us that God is all around us. The history of God's people is recounted in Psalm 78, That's one of the Psalms of Asaph, showing us that God has been at work the whole time. And the psalmist reminds the children of Israel to tell the next generation, even children yet to be born, about the Lord's great and mighty deeds. Book 4, Psalms 90 to 106, focuses on how God is above us. Psalm 90, the only psalm credited to Moses, and in it he speaks of how our lives on this earth are brief, so we need to number our days aright. God, on the other hand, is above us, is eternal, will reign forever and ever. The fifth and the final book, which take us from Psalm 107 to the end at Psalm 150, has the spotlight on how God is among us. So Psalm 118, as an example, says, "When I was hard pressed, I cried to the Lord. He brought me into a spacious place. The Lord is with me. I will not be afraid." So 5 books that shape the way we could read the Psalms. There are also 5 types of Psalms. Psalms of praise, generally focusing on the nature of God to encourage the believer to praise God for his goodness, his righteousness, his judgment and his wisdom. And many of those psalms refer to music or singing or rejoicing. There are also psalms of wisdom, containing, not surprisingly, teachings and wise advice. A bit like the book of Proverbs, but in poetic form. And mostly they instruct the believer in how to live a godly life. The third kind of psalm is a royal psalm. And this expresses in that poetic form the belief that God does his will and his good works through the authority of a king. Sometimes psalms celebrate the coronation or the good works of an earthly king. Other psalms compare God to an earthly king and even point to the coming of Messiah in Jesus. Fourthly, there are psalms of thanksgiving, where the believer praises and thanks God for what God has done, or for God's goodness in general. And of course, there are psalms of lament, psalms that respond to a crisis, a grief or despair, and express the conviction that God is present, even when human beings are too overwhelmed by their own sufferings to see them. There's often a shocking honesty in them. Plaintive cries like, "How long, O Lord?" feature. So we've looked at the 5 books in the book of Psalms. We've looked at 5 types of psalms. Then I want to look at what we could call the anatomy of a psalm. We're not as familiar these days in the Methodist Church with the psalms as some kinds of churches are, because it's not in our tradition to say or sing the set psalm from the lectionary each Sunday. The way that's done, we know it, we use it occasionally with the psalms in the back of our hymn book, that the leader says the first part of the psalm and then the congregation responds with the second part. We call that pointing the psalm. And it helps emphasize the way the psalm works. Firstly, it's poetry, as we keep saying. That means that the words, the idioms and the claims within the psalms are poetic and not to be taken literally. It's important to use our worshipful imagination to read beyond the words on the page. And for that, we need to understand the use of metaphor in the Psalms. James Mays has written the Interpretation Series commentary on Psalms, and he says this: a metaphor used for theological purposes is very serious business. it doesn't simply describe by comparison. A metaphor becomes the image as which and through which something or someone is known and understood. It conveys more, and it speaks more powerfully than is possible to do in regular speech. It draws on various experiences and evokes imagination. So Psalm 23 is a classic example. God isn't literally a shepherd, but the way God treats us is exactly how a good shepherd would lead their flock. We are not literally meant to lie down in a green field. That's quite nice sometimes when the sun's out. But what we believe in the psalm is that God wants the best for us, walks alongside us, and works to bring it about. So God leads and guides and accompanies us in the worst of times, brings us into God's eternal presence, and we anticipate a celebration with our cups running over. So there's a kind of shaping of how psalms work. Let's look now at Psalm 96, our psalm for this Sunday. It's a psalm of praise, and it's part of a quartet beginning at 96 and running through to Psalm 99 that celebrate Israel's God, who is enthroned as king over the whole cosmos. In the lectionary, it's frequently used on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day because of the Christian belief that God's determination to judge the world in righteousness and the people in faithfulness is ultimately fulfilled in the coming of Jesus Christ and his saving work on the cross. That is, in Jesus, God putting things right for all creation. Psalm 96 is one on which are based a number of the hymns and songs that we sing. So Let All the World in Every Corner Sing is written partly based on this psalm. Joy to the world, the Lord has come. Remember that line, let fields and floods, rocks, hills and plains repeat the sounding joy. And the chorus, great is the Lord and most worthy of praise, begins, that first line is directly from this psalm. This psalm proclaims God to all the world. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns, we read. We're required to sing to the Lord to proclaim his salvation. It's a psalm where we become the heralds. Heralds would have gone ahead of a victorious king after battle and announced his arrival to all people. That's what we do when we sing to the Lord and proclaim his salvation. When we declare God's glory in this psalm, the audience is everyone, all nations, all peoples. So we say among the nations, the Lord reigns, declaring God to be a just judge whose reign brings stability on the earth. So 3 things to say. Firstly, we sing a new song of God's glory. Remember, the opening of the psalm says, sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord all the earth. Sing to the Lord, praise his name, proclaim his salvation day after day. What is striking about the claims of Psalm 96 is how untrue many of the statements in the psalm might have seemed to those who spoke them. How could Israel claim that their God is feared above all gods, or that their God was king over all the earth? The people of Judah, we know from Scripture, were constantly under the cosh from surrounding enemy nations. They spent generations as slaves in Egypt. After entering the land God promised to them, they struggled with the Philistines, the Edomites, the Ammonites, and the Moabites. Moab, of course, we met in looking at Ruth over past weeks. Eventually they would be destroyed and exiled by the likes of Assyria and Babylon. And even in the days of David and Solomon, those glory days, they were still a small and rather insignificant kingdom in comparison with the great empires of their day. So what does it mean? Sing a new song. Well, we put ourselves in the place of the children of Israel. We sing now that God is our refuge and strength. We declare that God is the only one worthy of our worship. We sing there's no one like our God. But at the moment we are disrupted and confused by coronavirus, everything it's done to us, the families around us who are struggling, the businesses that have collapsed. How is it we sing a new song? Because we declare not just our commitment to be the people of God now, sharing that love and grace, but we declare we are convinced God will bring us to a place where there is no mourning, no sickness, no tears. And our praising celebrates a future reality of God's just and peaceable kingdom and the glimpses that we see of it today. It's not naive, it's not stupid, it's not a false hope. Old Testament professor Jerome Creech writes this: together, as we share Psalms, we declare what we believe about the world. And as we do, we create a community that not only believes in God's reign with the head, but also responds to God's kingdom with the heart. It is to live as though we belong to the kingdom of God, which means we work to bring justice and well-being, just as God also is working. So the first thing is we sing a new song of God's glory. The second is we bring a holy offering. We read from verse 7 of the psalm. Ascribe to the Lord, all you families of nations. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due to his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. Worship the Lord in the splendour of his holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. That more than once I've said when we've been looking at Bible texts that we need to dig a little bit deeper to appreciate the power of some biblical words and phrases. You can't simply read the text and say, I get that. This is one such time. To sing that the Lord reigns as a psalm is not simply the equivalent of a contemporary worship song. The Lord reigns was a declaration by God's people that the gods of other nations do not reign. You see, in the times when these words were being used first, the question that would be asked between nations and people groups would be, which God is your God? And which God rules the others? Because there was a pantheon of gods, and gods were localized and specific as well. You prayed to the God of the harvest for good crops. You prayed to your household God to look after your family. You prayed to the God who enabled fertility if it was proving difficult to have children. You prayed to the gods of your city. Do you remember the story in the book of Acts where Paul preaches in Athens and in the days before it has toured the city and seen all sorts of gods, even a nameless God, to stand in for the ones people have forgotten? Psalm 96 says, this God, the God of Israel, the God of creation, the God who has rescued a nation and given them a hope and a future, is the God. And so to sing it out, to speak it out, is to challenge the whole earth, the families of nations, not to just declare that the Lord reigns, but to tremble at that truth, because this God is over every other God. We're challenged to bring offerings into God's presence, to bring our worship, to bring ourselves, to bring our gifts and talents, to be overwhelmed by the holiness of God, who reigns, who is king over all gods. How do we bring holy offerings? Well, we intentionally make ourselves present. That is, we acknowledge that where we are is where God is. We come, if you like, onto God's territory, and we've put ourselves in the place where God can speak to us and reach us. Being present to God is seeking to live in the holiness of God. Not to get dragged into all sorts of infighting between gods, but to stand with our God and to declare the Lord reigns. That is, to anticipate and seek God's rule and justice for the whole earth. So we sing a new song of God's glory. We bring a holy offering. And thirdly, we partner with all creation. The text of the psalm says in verse 5, "For the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens." And then from verse 11, "Let the heavens rejoice. Let the earth be glad. Let the sea resound and all that is in it. Let the fields be jubilant and everything in them. Let all the trees of the forest sing for joy. Let all creation rejoice before the Lord." It would be easy to believe that issues like greening the planet, tackling the destruction of the rainforests, urging governments to care for those struggling to survive through drought, feels as though it ought to be a new movement. At the Methodist Conference only last week, the young people of the church challenged us to recognise that our stewardship of the planet is a priority. Here in Romsey, we've been doing our bit for some years, and the Eco Church Gold Award celebrates that. But in a number of parts of the church, that urgency isn't so obvious. And the cry of the young people of the church and many others is not taken up. Well, here in Psalm 96, we discover that the eco conversation is ancient. The whole earth is God's because God made it. In another dig at pagan worship, the psalm says that the other gods are idols, therefore created by human beings and capable of nothing. But this God, the God, made the heavens. And that moves us beyond planet Earth to the whole heavens. And to think that God is any less than the creator of all that exists, we would have to say that God created Earth for human beings, but not Mars, not Jupiter, not the solar system, not the universes, just one little corner. Remember that verse that John Evans introduced us to from another of the Psalms, Psalm 104. The Message version says, "The glory of God, let it last forever. Let God enjoy his creation." That ought to be the shout of the church today. What does it mean? Well, contrast the imagery from this psalm, which talks about a glad earth set against drought and the loss of habitats here. The psalm talks about resounding seas. Set that against the rising oceans which swallow ancient lands. The psalm talks about jubilant fields. Set that against struggling agricultural communities where climate change has ruined the harvest. God's desire, the psalmist says, is for all creation to be able to rejoice. And what's our role? Well, we are called to be partners with God and with the whole created order, the natural world, the planets, all people. Our acts of praise are therefore in our lifestyle, and we should be through that encouraging equitable fishing policies, protection of forests, sustainability in agriculture, care for refugees, calling out those companies who contribute to the destruction of the natural world. We should speak out for policies that rebuild lives, rebuild communities, that care for the seas, the trees, and the fields. And we cannot sing a new song for God's glory without bringing ourselves as a holy offering that declares our God reigns. We cannot bring a holy offering unless we are committed to being partners with all creation. The words of Psalm 96 are ancient but deeply timely. They speak of God. They celebrate the God who made the heavens and who rules over all things. And the words challenge us to live for God here and now. Amen.